welcome. In this episode, I'm going to share encounters with humanoid figures I found on the internet. I originally set out to make an episode about crawlers, but came across some stories about humanoid figures that, while they do resemble crawlers, vary a bit in appearance. These stories include the sighting of a creature in Black Hills, South Dakota, a being watching a group of friends in the forest one night, and the sighting of a creature followed by weird lights in the sky and voices heard throughout the night. But first we start with yet another story with encounters and dreams of the creature that seem to be linked. And this isn't just one person. It happened to 3 different people in 3 different places. Also, if you'd like to help support the channel, click on the join button below. Alright, let's get to today's stories. The first story of this episode is 2 stories in one, as the original poster, or OP, details an encounter she had with a being, then gives the account of a friend who encountered something exactly like it. In fact, they began having dreams about the creature not long after telling each other their stories. Her story takes place in Rossville, Illinois, when she was in high school. Rossville is a small town in eastern Illinois not that far from the Indiana border. It is in Vermilion County, covers just 1.4 square miles, and has a population of 1,221 as of the 2020 census. The OP and her friend had a loop they liked to walk that began at her friend's house, went through a park, and to the side entrance of a cemetery on the southwest corner of town. They would cut straight through the cemetery in order to reach another street that led them back to the main road her friend's house was on. Beyond the cemetery were cornfields and a forest. They set out one night on a warm evening in late summer or early fall, entering the cemetery and were walking the road that ran down the middle of the property when they began to hear something that made them stop. Her friend let out a nervous laugh before asking the OP if she heard it too. Not only did she hear the noise, but she also saw what was making it. To the girl's left, she saw something running through the cemetery behind the headstones. It was running on all 4s, but it looked to be a humanoid with very pale skin, no hair, and was abnormally skinny. She distinctly remembers that this thing was so pale it seemed to be reflecting the moonlight, and it was running very fast. Way too fast, in fact, for a human on all 4s. It was so quick that she could not make out any facial details on the creature. She goes on to say that the way it ran was animal-like, almost like a big cat or wild dog where its feet would surpass its hands while striding. Terrified, they stood there frozen by fear, panicking, listening as the creature ran through the cemetery just out of sight. They decided to call a friend to come meet them who would walk them home, but once he arrived at the cemetery, he wanted to hang out and goof off there. The OP says having him there acting dumb made it a lot less scary, but for the remainder of their stay, they continued hearing the creature run around the cemetery, circling them. Sometimes it would venture a little closer to them, but then it would dart away and mainly make wide circles and always stayed just out of sight. The 3 of them eventually left and the OP began researching what this thing could have been. She even reached out to a paranormal group in Champaign, Illinois for advice. But the person she talked to had no answers for her. He did, however, want to document her story, but the group never investigated any further. Her story then moves forward 3 years to when she was living in Aurora, Colorado. Aurora is located in Douglas County in central Colorado. It has a population of more than 386,000 according to the 2020 census and covers a total area of just over 160 square miles. She and one of her closest friends she met while living in Aurora hit it off because of their mutual interest in the paranormal. She told him about the time she saw a creature in the cemetery and his jaw dropped. He then told her he had seen something exactly like what she described. He saw a creature matching the same description she gave of the one she saw, pale skin, hairless, emaciated, crouching down under his porch one night. He believes he interrupted the being while it was eating, as it was hunched over and looked to be holding something. He is of Navajo Apache background and believed at the time he saw either a skinwalker or a wendigo. He had his doubts then, but especially at the time of telling the OP about what he actually saw. At the time of his encounter, he was dating a girl whose mother claimed to be a medium. She told him that someone had, quote, woken up the creature and now it was angry. But the OP and her friend both have serious doubts about the medium's claim. However, the strangest part of the story takes place after the two shared their encounters with each other, when they began having nightmares about the creatures they saw. The OP's friend got the worst of that deal as his nightmares far surpassed hers, but it all came to a point in a period of about 6 months when they had bad luck and high anxiety. She dismissed what happened and everything they went through as them psyching themselves out. That is, until she submitted her story to a podcast that read it and a listener sent their story in, which was an encounter with exactly what her and her friends saw. But the weirdest part was that the listener's encounter was also followed by nightmares, and they matched exactly the nightmares had by the OP's friend. Neither of them have ever told anyone what happened in their nightmares either. Since everything that has happened, the OP has scoured the internet for stories and answers, searching through lore and all types of cryptids, but she still does not have a definitive answer for what she saw in the cemetery. And she definitely feels like the nightmares she and her friend had are not a coincidence. She also believes that the being is interdimensional. All in all, she does not feel like she can provide a concrete answer as for what she saw that night. She has ruled out a Wendigo, Skinwalker, Ghoul, and Fleshgate, which is another term for Goatman. The having nightmares about the beings after encountering them is really starting to become a disturbing trend. And I know it could very well be dismissed as just having bad dreams about something traumatic that happened to them, which it could very well be. She doesn't give details about her nightmares or those of her friend, but they both seem to think it's connected. It's kind of like a story I did in my previous episode where the person was having dreams about a creature he had yet to encounter, but weird things were happening all around him, linking it all back to the creature. This could very well be what is happening here too. And it is starting to happen a lot more often as I continue to come across this phenomenon. But to have 3 people all have nightmares after seeing a creature that matches exactly what they saw, and for the listener who wrote in to not only see the same type of creature but for their nightmares to match the OP's friend, I'm starting to think this isn't a coincidence either. Also, her believing these beings are interdimensional is a widely accepted theory about these creatures. It would certainly explain how they can be there one second and seem to completely vanish the next. This theory certainly has its following, and some of the things said about it make a lot of sense. As for what she saw, I believe this was a crawler. Everything she described it as looking like and how it acted all point to this. What do you think she saw? And what do you make of the nightmares not just she but all 3 different people had? Also, could these beings be interdimensional? The next story comes to us from a poster who saw a weird humanoid creature in the Black Hills in South Dakota. The Black Hills are an isolated mountain range in western South Dakota. The highest peak is named Black Elk Peak and reaches an elevation of 7,244 feet. The range covers a total area of 5,000 square miles. The original poster was 17 years old at the time of his encounter and was in South Dakota working for the summer and staying with family. He had been there for about a month with no occurrences, but then one night he went out with his brother, sister, and her husband to shoot guns in the forest. They went at night because the OP was working the evening shift that night and didn't get off work until about 10 p.m. Once his shift ended, they loaded up the truck with their firearms, ammo, and snacks and set out for the Black Hills. They drove for 45 minutes and ended up heading down a dirt road surrounded by trees and tall grass. They eventually came to a clearing that was open and flat with the nearest tree line being about 100 feet away. It was fairly dark out, but the truck's headlights lit up the clearing. An uneasy feeling came over the OP, but he just figured it was because he was in the woods at night. They started setting up plastic bottles and empty water cooler jugs for targets when they suddenly felt like they were being watched. This feeling was immediately followed by a terrible smell he says smelled a lot like spoiled eggs, and it reeked. They began looking around the area to see if they could pinpoint where it was coming from, and that's when the OP saw something that still sits vividly in his mind 5 years later, like he just saw it yesterday. He saw amongst the trees a humanoid figure that was crouching down looking at them. The creature, even while crouching, was still about 6 feet in height, and so skinny the OP says calling it skin and bones doesn't do this thing's appearance justice. Everyone saw it, but in different spots as it moved around the tree line watching them. They all described it as tall, thin, and having long dark hair. The group packed up everything as quickly as they could and they got out of there. The OP says the feeling of dread that settled over him that night will haunt him forever. His brother has since mentioned that the area where they were could have been Native American territory, but the OP isn't too sure about that. Since his encounter, he checks stories online to see if anything matches what he saw that night, but says nothing looks quite like whatever that humanoid creature was. Everything about this encounter and the description of the creature screams crawler to me, except for the long dark hair. That's a new one for me. One commenter did say they have heard stories where crawlers are said to have long hair like this, but I've never come across any myself. I can't discount this, but at the same time I can't exactly say what the OP and his family saw that night was a crawler. Whatever it was certainly was strange, and I think I would have gotten out of there too, even if I had firearms with me. But from most stories I've heard, bullets don't seem to affect cryptids anyway, unless it is a very well-placed shot. What do you think this was? A crawler with hair, or something else? The next story comes to us from northeast Oklahoma on a Cherokee reservation and took place back in 2008, where the original poster witnessed something strange in the woods while hanging out with a group of friends one night. He does not say where exactly his story takes place. He and his friend group were all around 15 or 16 years old at the time. On the night of their encounter, the group of boys met at a friend's house whose property had a trail that led out about 1/4 of a mile into the forest and eventually came to an open area that had a fire pit and a single tree. There was another trail leading away to the south. The clearing would be their destination for the night, so they headed out to the spot, got a fire going, and started hanging out. He points out that there were 9 of them total, and they were not drinking or smoking anything. Everything was going good until about 2:30 or 3 in the morning, when their fun-filled trip took a very weird turn. The OP glanced up at one of his friends who had gotten up and started heading to the beginning of that trail leading south to answer nature's call. But something caught his attention farther up the trail amongst the trees no more than 20 yards away. Standing there watching them was a tall humanoid figure. He says it was approximately 7 feet in height, was gray but had a static cloudy look to it, and had odd proportions. He says its legs began near where its chest plate was, and it had very long lanky arms that reached down to its knees. It had black hollow eyes and no mouth or nose. He quietly asked his friend who was closest to this being if he saw it. His friend looked up at it and made his way back over to the fire and the rest of the group. The OP did not take his eyes off the figure as it stood there staring at him and his friends. By this point, everyone in his friend group had seen the being standing there and all eyes were on it. It slowly started walking from left to right through the trees, never getting closer to the OP and his friends. While walking, it passed a rock wall that was 7 feet tall and was easily taller than the formation. It kept walking until it started getting deeper into the woods and slowly faded from view. The group stayed close to the fire until the sun came up and got out of there as fast as they could. They didn't talk about it for years after their encounter, but the OP has told some people who are close to him. Now, 15 years later, he has asked his friends who were there that night if they remember. All 9 people remember seeing the being, exactly what it looked like, and the path it walked amongst the trees. It always adds credence to stories for me when there are more than one witness who all corroborate the sighting. Now I know the account given only comes from one person who says they all saw it, but still, there are too many strange beings seen out in the woods and more stories coming in from all over the world to discount them as a hoax. As for this story, I lean toward crawler, but the way the OP described it moving slowly, I won't commit to that 100%. There is also the way he describes it disappearing. I couldn't tell if he meant it faded away like disappeared, or it just backed away through the trees until they couldn't see it. If it just faded out of sight, this could point to the theory that these beings are interdimensional, as I mentioned in the first story. This is all speculation, of course, as I'm not entirely sure what the OP meant when he said that the being faded from view, but I thought it was worth mentioning. What do you think he and his friends saw that night? The final story of this episode also documents 2 encounters with a humanoid figure, but is actually a response to a post, which gives us 2 encounters in one for this story too, with both happening in the same location. We will start with the original poster's tale, which is a short one and was posted online because she was looking for answers about the weird creature she saw in the woods while camping one night in the summer of 2022. Her story takes place in Arkansas in the Ouachita mountain range. The Ouachita Mountains, simply referred to as the Ouachitas, is a mountain range that covers western Arkansas and southeastern Oklahoma. The range's highest peak reaches an elevation of 2,753 feet, or 839 meters. The OP and her boyfriend decided to go on a camping trip in the Ouachita Forest in Arkansas, so they took the Winona Scenic Route up through the gorgeous spillway, according to the OP, to a campsite by a creek, where they set up camp and settled into a hammock to relax. As they lay there, their dog, who they brought along with them, began growling. The OP describes the growling as a low, deep growl she had never heard come from her dog before. Curious, she looks in the direction her dog is growling and sees a humanoid figure amongst the trees. It was just strolling by their camp about 20 to 30 feet into the forest. According to the OP, it was approximately 7 feet tall, a grayish, marble whitish color, extremely skinny, and had a large head. However, it didn't seem to notice them until their dog barked at it, drawing its attention. The creature stopped, watched them for about 30 seconds, and then went on its way. The OP and her boyfriend immediately packed up their belongings and left. She mentions that they were both sober when they had their encounter. She ends her post by saying how scared she was when she saw the creature and is curious to know if her and her boyfriend were the only ones to see anything like the creature in the Ouachita Forest. Well, her story drew the attention of someone who had 2 different encounters in the same spot the OP had hers. She goes to that spot maybe once a year because every time she does, she gets an eerie feeling whenever she's out there. And she mentions 2 stories that are the main encounters she has had in the Ouachita Forest, but she does mention that she has had a lot of smaller things happen and a bunch of strange occurrences in the area. She shares the experience that is the most relevant to the OP's story. Her encounter took place while she was on a camping trip with a large group celebrating the 4th of July. The spot, which she says is the same spot as the OP of the first story, is in a very remote location in Madison County, Arkansas. Getting to their spot was a bit difficult due to flooding in the area, but they were eventually able to make it there and started setting up their camp. But while setting up camp, one of the guys in the group suddenly dropped what he was doing and began staring into the forest. He mentioned to the OP of this second story that she should call her dog back to camp because he saw someone in the woods. When they normally arrive in the spot, she lets her dog loose so he can go chase some deer in the woods. The OP was concerned but also knew that there were caves in the area people like to hike to. However, she later found out that her friend actually saw a tall gray humanoid in the forest. He was so shaken by what he saw that he stayed by the fire the rest of the night, even when everyone else went out to gather firewood. Later that night, the OP had wandered off into the woods beyond the tents to answer nature's call. As she was walking past the tents, though, she heard what sounded like someone rummaging through someone's belongings and looking through their tent. The only problem with this was that everyone who was with them on the trip was still sitting by the fire. No one but the OP was away from the fire at the time. Perplexed, she wondered aloud, "Who is this?" But no one answered. This led her to believe an animal had gotten into someone's tent, but then the noise suddenly stopped. She opened the tent the noise was coming from, but it was completely empty. She shined her light all around but found no evidence that a woodland critter had been anywhere near it. At that point, she found herself wondering if the noise she heard was even coming from the tents at all. A little while later, she was sitting around the fire with the rest of the group when they began to see lights moving in the sky. Soon, everyone was watching these lights that were in a grid-like pattern and moving almost in a sequence overhead when they all started freaking out. A few hours later, the OP had gone to her tent to sleep, leaving her boyfriend and 3 others in their sleeping bags by the fire. She then began hearing voices. She couldn't make out what they were saying, but they were constant throughout the night and continued until daybreak. She barely got any sleep and told those who slept around the campfire that they kept her up all night due to their constant talking and how loud they had been. The 4 of them looked at each other and told her that they hadn't spoken since deciding to turn in for the night, before asking her, "What do you mean you heard voices?" She told them she heard them all night, but she was the only one who did. She has been back to that same spot many times and has seen lights in the sky on different occasions, but never as close as what she saw that night. She can't help but shake the feeling that something was out there watching and/or studying them. At first, when I read these 2 stories, I was thinking crawler. But then the OP of the first story described the being she saw as having a large head. Then the second story mentioned lights moving in a pattern. This makes me think it could have been something else entirely. Perhaps an alien, or a gray as they are commonly referred to. I mentioned before in other videos how there is a theory about aliens and cryptids being linked. And there are many accounts where people see either more than one cryptid in an area or cryptids and UFOs. But this just seems to be the latter to me. I know I don't usually do alien UFO stories, but this was too good of a story with multiple encounters in one camping spot to pass up. Plus, neither poster is really sure what they saw. What do you think is lurking about in the Washita Forest in Arkansas? And that's going to do it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed these stories. If you'd like to hear more stories like these and other types of cryptids, make sure to subscribe to the channel. If you want to send me your story, I'd love to read it. My email is wolfwhocriedcryptid@gmail.com. I will also put it in the description below. With your permission, I may want to use it in an episode. Even if you'd prefer that I didn't share your story on my channel and just want someone to listen, email me. We can privately talk about your encounter. And please remember to keep it civil in the comments section. No one deserves to be ridiculed whether they believe or not. Thank you for listening. I'll catch you at the next episode.